Okay, well, I guess we can make a start and do the introductions in case people are a little late joining. So thank you everybody for joining and good afternoon to you all. So my name is Mike Brock. I'm a lecturer in the School of Economics here at the University of East Anglia in Norwich. So this is the second of our lecture series that we're doing through the Wien Studies Network. Superbly organized by Sylvia, who's also here to also help alongside and chaired the first session and gave me a really hard act to follow. So the kind of focus of this session is looking at the kind of interplay between the kind of vegan movement and the economy, and thinking about the economic aspects that are at play here. And I'm delighted to say we've got two different speakers for the session. So we've got my colleague in the School of Economics, Stefan Penczynski, and he's going to sort of look at the more academic side and looking at the perspectives in that area. And then we've got Mike Hill from One Planet Pizza, who's going to give us the perspective of running a business in this kind of sustainable format and the kind of both opportunities and challenges that are coming from that. So for anybody who just joined, just a little bit of housekeeping. Obviously, I think as you joined, you were muted. That's just to kind of keep things kind of easy for the speakers. If towards the end, when we're in the Q&A, you want to ask a question or come onto the microphone, please do so. And we've got the chat function, so if something comes up through one talk or the other that you want to ask, then please post your question, and one of us as co-hosts will pick up those questions and also use them to kind of kick off the Q&A. I guess the only other thing to make you aware of is that the talks themselves are going to be recorded, and then we'll stop the recording when we get to the Q&A stage. In terms of time, we're hoping that we've got the session as put down until around 5:30, and we'll see how we go in terms of the talks. I think each of the talks from Stefan and from Mike are going to be around 15, 20 minutes, something like that each, giving plenty of time for kind of discussion afterwards. So I'll stop talking and I'll hand over to Stefan, who's going to go first. And so, like I say, thank you all for joining, and hope you enjoy this session.
All right, thanks so much, Mike, for the introduction and the housekeeping. Let me try to share my presentation so that you see what I'm talking about. Yeah, so I want to just put out a few thoughts on the question, what is the best diet for the economy? My name is Stefan Penczinski. I'm at UEA in the School of Economics. I'm also a member and director of the Center for Behavioral and Experimental Social Sciences, and a member of the Vegan Studies Network that organized this lecture series. So I'm very happy to talk about this and get going here. And actually, I want to start with the the view that as an economist, I have to say it always depends. So I have to answer this question. It of course depends what's the best diet for the economy, and it depends on who we mean with the economy. For whom is it the best? Who is the economy? Of course, one can aggregate that, but we have to, of course, keep in view that there's consumers and producers, and the producers would be producing food or healthcare services. And also there's a question, what is the best? So what's the measure for the best diet? If we talk about the economy, do we talk about GDP, gross domestic product, or would we want to talk about other measures like well-being, happiness, health measures, or other measures of welfare or utility? So in a sense, I can already lower expectations as to how concrete the answer will be, but I think it can still be useful to think about this question. All right. I also have to say that I'm experimentally working behavioral economist, and so I'm not, particularly expert in the field of nutrition. I will talk quite a bit about health, And so some of what I will say has also a very a personal context, a very personal motivation. Okay, but let's kind of keep with the question and just, for the fun of it, think about a hypothesis that one could make. We could argue that the Western diet, as we observe it in the Western countries, is actually the best for the economy. And theoretically, that might make sense because we could think about counter arguments. So if a better diet existed, that would allow for more value to be generated and profit to be made, then a value-seeking society and a profit-seeking market economy would actually find this diet and follow it. And one could say, thanks for your attention and leave it at that. I'm, of course, not going to do that, but that is one way of looking at it. And of course, economists know about the limitations of market economies and also the possibility of ending up in an suboptimal equilibrium. But it will still be very difficult to counter the argument and this hypothesis and say, well, I will present you an alternative that I think will lead to, let's say, a higher GDP. That's going to be very difficult argument to make. So I'm not going to go down that route today either. But what I think could be insightful is to think about other measures that could be used in order to evaluate a society's situation. And we can observe that there are some of these measures that are in conflict with GDP as a measure of success. So let's take a look at the share of populations with cancer versus GDP per capita. So here on the horizontal axis, you see GDP per capita, and on the vertical axis, the share of population with cancer. And here you can see that, as GDP increases across countries, we see a higher share of population with cancer. And well, there are many views on this and takes on this, but I would argue that one of the mechanisms that leads to this graph is actually the kind of diet that is followed in richer countries. Okay. Now, at this point, we could say, okay, so there might be a diet that is better in terms of other measures than GDP. And this lecture series is focusing on, arguing or discussing and maybe finding better diets in terms of human health, in terms of the planet, maybe in terms of animal welfare. So this graph, as just one example, might suggest that we are not optimizing, so that there might be something better out there. So if that's the case, then we could also ask, and these are relatively, economist type questions, what leads us to currently follow a suboptimal diet? And I will touch upon a couple of things. So it could be that there's a lack of information to identify a satisfying and healthy, sustainable, ethical diet. It could be that experts' incentives to provide such information are lacking. We could also wonder, what are consumers' incentives to follow a better diet and request it in the market? And then think about producers' incentives to provide adequate products. Okay, and these are to be touched upon in the following slides. And you can see that this will lead us to talk about Mike's business and the products that he's providing. Okay, and I mentioned that it's going to be somewhat of a personal talk. So I myself found myself shifting to another equilibrium, if you will, another personal equilibrium. I can trace this back to seeing this TED Talk that is indicated here. And since 2014, I'm following a starch-based diet, which is based on starches with the addition of vegetables and fruits. So I'm eating beans, peas, lentils, corn, bread, pasta, potatoes, rice, sweet potatoes, and other starches. I'm eating even pizza regularly. That diet does not contain any animal foods and no vegetable oils. It might contain salt, sugar, and spices. and I'm also supplementing B12. And so basically, I want to put this out there and in a relatively economic method, wonder, could that be an equilibrium, a diet that we could converge to? And if so, would that be a kind of diet that we stick with? Are there enough arguments and incentives to stick with such a diet? And interestingly, we can do such a shift from one day to the next. So that's, I think, very important in order to contribute to sustainability and so forth. Another interesting lesson, I think, from this kind of diet is that, and that's a lesson maybe for vegans, is that it tells us what to eat. It doesn't only tell us what not to eat. And I think that's very attractive about this as well. So if we want to eat that, let's consider a couple of aspects of diets and wonder whether we would continue eating this kind of diet. So the first one is the question of whether it's filling and energizing. That's the purpose of food. And if we look at this graph, which shows you the caloric density of various foods, then you will see that many starches like oatmeal, boiled potatoes, brown rice, beans, white rice, pasta, and so forth, they are located around 1 kilocalorie per gram. And that means that you have about 2.3 or 2.4 kilogram of potatoes, if you only ate potatoes, to get 2,000 or 2,500 kilocalories a day. And that would certainly fill you. So that would be very filling. You could then eat as much as you want of this. There would be no self-control needed. You won't feel guilty about it afterwards, even though you might feel pretty full. And this kind of diet would also be very energizing. Marathoners know that they prefer carbo loading on pasta before a run, and these foods are doing exactly this. So if you were to follow a diet with foods that are higher in caloric density, then you would either be hungry or overweight in the long run. Okay, so that was one aspect. Another aspect is, for an economist, certainly important, whether it's expensive or inexpensive. And here, this graph shows you a couple of common foods. And let me point you to the starches. We have beans, peas, lentils down here. They are the most inexpensive of the pack. We have oatmeal, rice, quinoa. Sorry, I should point actually on the presentation so you can follow me. I'm sorry about this. So we have beans and lentils down here, very inexpensive, cost per 100 calories. Same for whole grains like oatmeal, brown rice, wheat bread. And then the two left columns give us the cost per edible cup. And here potatoes and sweet potatoes are also very inexpensive. Okay, so if you follow that diet, you will actually most likely be cutting costs. Another aspect of this diet is also that it's rather inconspicuous, so you will not be able to brag a lot about the kinds of things that you eat. Okay, now the next aspect I want to mention is the tastiness, and maybe you tell me now, okay, don't tell me that this is tasty, what you're suggesting. I do find it very tasty, and I think it's interesting to consider why many people don't find it tasty, and that has to do with the pleasure trap, which is graphically shown here. It's basically a process of neural adaptation, where if you start out eating whole natural foods, that's going to bring you into a normal pleasure zone. And if you then continue, or if you then eat more stimulant foods, like more processed, richer foods, you will get to an enhanced pleasure zone. So you will derive a lot of pleasure from it. But due to neural adaptation, there will be a decreased responsiveness. You get used to that. And then eating this rich food, brings you just in the normal pleasure zone. And so getting back to eating whole natural foods will feel painful because that will bring you down to the subnormal pleasure zone. So that's why many people don't find this food tasty. And that's unfortunate in a sense. They are in the wrong personal equilibrium when it comes to their taste buds, I guess. But it also shows, this graph also shows the incentives for food producers and restaurants to make it tasty. So you, as a restaurant or food producer, you don't probably want to send your customers into the subnormal pleasure zone. You will certainly want to send them in the enhanced pleasure zone, so to say. And therefore, I think there's an incentive to make foods very rich and processed. Okay, the final aspect that I want to touch upon is health. I want to give you a few statistics of what would happen if you were to follow this diet for 7 days. So this is from a publication that indicated what kind of changes can be observed in people that follow this diet for 7 days ad libitum. So that means you eat as much as you want. And here you can see the blood pressure reductions after 7 days, and they are noticeable. And the higher you start in terms of your blood pressure, the more is the stronger is the effect of the reduction. The same is true for cholesterol. So also here, there are very significant cholesterol reductions after 7 days. The higher your starting level of cholesterol, the higher will be the reduction in cholesterol. As an example, I'm also showing you weight loss after 7 days in women. And here you can see that also there's a substantial weight loss after 7 days. Again, the more weight you have to start with, the stronger will be the weight loss. Okay. All right. So what does that mean? Apart from the welfare and the utility you derive from your health, what does that mean economically? So the McDougall dietary program was at some point implemented in a large US company, and that documented a 44% reduction in healthcare costs on the basis of the insurance claims. And that therefore, is a very significant number economically speaking. So I think that's quite impressive. It stays, of course, in the realm of anecdotes, but still, it is then interesting to look at, what are the common substitutes that you might have for enjoying such effects of a healthy diet, and then we can look at the global revenues of pharmaceutical or health industries, like there's a bit more than $22 billion globally spent every year, and concretely in 2018 on blood pressure lowering drugs, $19.3 billion on cholesterol lowering drugs. There's $1.6 billion spent on devices for bariatric surgery, where you decrease the volume of your stomach. So it is worthwhile noting that these will be substitute products and therefore competing products to a healthy diet. If we all were to follow a healthy diet, these global revenues would shrink considerably. So here, healthy diets, they will not favor such healthcare businesses. Okay. Similarly, we can take a look at the UK. I recently read that diet-related chronic disease accounts for 6.1 billion of annual NHS spend, which is around 9% of the entire budget. And here, I think it would be interesting to think about, what could be done with this money if you don't have to spend it on diet-related chronic disease. You could improve the quality of the NHS in other dimensions, or cut the cost, but also that would imply that the NHS would employ fewer doctors and nurses, or would give rise to fewer pharmaceutical business and so forth. So in general, we can observe that healthy diets, they don't necessarily favor healthcare business. And I'm not quite sure how I am in time, but maybe two more thoughts on the economics of healthcare. One is that healthcare is a credence good, which implies that quality of service cannot be observed even after consumption. So it's different from an experience good like a cinema visit, where you don't know prior to consumption what the movie is going to be like, but you certainly know afterwards. In a credence good, you might not know whether you have been treated well. And one main example in the economic literature is auto repairs for this kind of product. And there's a literature showing that more than half of car repairs are unnecessary. There's a similar observation in the realm of health. The average person's probability of receiving one of 7 major surgical interventions is about 1/3 above that of a physician or a member of a physician's family. So this implies that, you know, either physicians and their family, they don't need these products or they don't believe in these products. It might also imply that they might know about this substitute for surgery, like a healthy diet, but they might not be able to reach patients and convince them to go down that route. In that vein, John McDougall that I was referring to earlier, he anecdotally mentions a cardiologist colleague that refers family members to McDougall's dietary clinic, but not his patients. And then the last point I want to make on the economics of things, who informs consumers about diet? And I noticed at some point when we still had posters around and were before lockdown advertising for this event, people were looking at this and were wondering, you know, how informative is information on the best diet coming from the Vegan Studies Network? I can assure you that we don't have strong financial incentives in any of these matters. But it's informative, I think, to look at, for example, the recommended daily intake of eggs from the US dietary guidelines. Who is providing this information? So these guidelines are written by an advisory committee that is made up to 50% by people from the US Department of Agriculture. A subsection of this department is the American Egg Board, which is encouraging utilization of egg products and so forth, make them more acceptable. And they have a science center, which is called the Egg Nutrition Center, that is funding 8 out of 12 studies that are cited in the 2015 guidelines. So I think it's worthwhile to wonder, you know, who is providing this information about diet, and in this example, the intake of eggs. I have a little lab experiment that shows that too little skepticism of consumers in the face of information that is disclosed by interested parties, and that is especially the case in competitive industries. So that's my modest contribution to this discussion, and I think it's a very important one. All right, so finally, let's try to be more optimistic and look at the opportunities that are ahead of us. So the number of vegans in Great Britain has quadrupled between 2014 and 2019. I think that's a very interesting development. The market for vegan food products is at $14.2 billion worldwide. It's expected to grow at 10.5% per year. So basically, if you spend less money on unhealthy food and healthcare, that gives rise to these opportunities where you spend more money on healthy foods, and maybe you might want to spend more money on high quality foods or sustainably and ethically grown foods. And yeah, so that would, I think, leave us at looking into such a business and looking at opportunities in the field of business, and hear from Mike.
Stefan, thank you very much, first of all. Before we move on to Mike's presentation, we have a couple of comments in the chat, and I wonder if you wanted to respond to them.
Sure.
There is one by Natasha, who says that consumer information about diets is quite variable. Note that the UK Eat Well recommendations are quite different to the more recent Eat Lancet recommendation for a healthy, environmentally sustainable diet. And then there is a question from Tobias who are asking, what is the recommended intake of eggs in the US compared to that in the UK or the EU? I don't know if you know.
Well, I know the discussion at the time in 2015 about the guidelines, which initially, so there was a draft of the guidelines which wanted to basically remove an upper limit on, how many eggs should be reasonably and healthily consumed. So I remember that it took some lawsuits and some discussion for the guidelines not to remove this upper limit. I don't exactly know if there's and what exactly are the recommended levels of egg consumption in the EU or in the UK. I don't know.
And also Peter is asking, how does the McDougall diet compare to a standard vegan diet? Is the main difference cutting out vegetable oils?
One thing that I alluded to earlier, the vegan diet is not very well specified, I find. So if you eat French fries and you drink Coke, you follow a vegan diet. So I'm not quite sure what is the vegan diet that people have in mind. I often find that it's just defined by what you don't eat. It's not very specific on what you should eat or what you want to eat. So in that sense, I can just say that this diet is a vegan diet. It's one of many, I guess. Yes.
Well, since you're taking some questions, I don't know if you want to take one more from Jan Deckers.
Sure.
Hello, Stefan. Thank you for your talk. You mentioned that the starch diet, which is the McDougall diet, I guess, did not contain vegetable oils. But then in the next slide, you mentioned olive oils. I guess that olives aren't vegetables. Is that why they are included on that slide?
The slide was about the cost of various different items that you might want to eat, right? I mean, these also include, cheddar cheese. So I didn't.
Okay.
I just pointed out a few that would qualify and fall under that diet. I didn't, it's not a diagram that entirely satisfies.
Okay.
Falls under that diet.
So by no vegetable oils, you mean no olive oil either?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, right. And the other question is, if I may,
Sure.
I'm surprised that McDougall doesn't refer his own patients to his diet, but only his family members. I didn't quite understand what motivated him to do so.
Okay, let me clarify that. Maybe it was not entirely clear. He was talking to a friend of his or a colleague of his who is cardiologist. So he himself is a general doctor, but his friend is a cardiologist. The cardiologist, he is sending his family members to McDougall's dietary clinic, but he has never referred patients. So the doctor that is cardiologist seems to make a difference between family members that he might care about and patients where he might have, a more economic interest in them.
Okay, thank you.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, Sean, do you want to raise a question?
Is it possible to have a copy of the slides? They're fascinating, very interesting. It's very
The recording will be on the website, and I think it should be no problem to also put the slides up.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
So if you're happy to take a couple more questions, and if Mike is happy to wait, we have another hand now from Natasha.
You're muted, Natasha, still.
You'd think we knew we'd know how to do this by now, wouldn't we, after all this time? Yeah, I put a comment there about what's been going on in France with this discussion around meatless diets for children, just for people who aren't aware of that. So just interesting to think about that in the economics perspective. And I was really struck by that statistic that you gave of the diet-related illnesses costing 9% of the NHS budget. And I just wondered if you know if there have been any kind of costings about where that money could be better spent and so on, because I would have thought something like that might be quite a good incentive for really for change based on kind of investments and how tight NHS funding is currently.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not an expert on the NHS. I think what is interesting for me is that the NHS has all the right incentives to, advertise and kind of make sure that people follow a healthy diet. And that's a rather luxurious situation that the UK is in. There are other countries with other health systems where these interests, they don't lie with any institution. The insurances, if they are able to cut costs, they will not necessarily benefit from that because they might, due to competition, might forward that to their customers. And so in general, I think, and that's, I unfortunately, that's all that I might be able to say on that, because I just don't know the NHS closely enough. But it's great to have such incentives. In other countries, again, there's no institution that has such incentives. It's very difficult to get to have a business model around prevention, to have a business model around providing information about healthy diets. So that makes the situation of the UK quite lucky or kind of useful to work with. But I'm sure the NHS would find areas where it could spend this money better.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think interestingly, this lecture series was originally funded by the Norwich Medical School, and we did spend some time emailing people at the NHS, asking them to come and comment on the economic phases of diet. And it was very difficult to find a response for them. I don't know if you remember, Stefan, how
yes,
reluctant they were. And I wonder if it's because it's something that hasn't been factored in properly, because it's difficult to acknowledge that it may require such a drastic difference in diet in order to actually make a change for the economic aspect of the NHS. But it wasn't a conversation that they seemed to be very willing to have. And but I think it is worth investigating further. Anyway, thank you so much, Stefan, for your presentation. There is another comment by Nigel about the economic cost of zoonotic diseases, but I hear that Mike is going to talk about that in his presentation, so I think we can let Mike share his slides now.